My name is Lauren. I'm 27 years old, and if someone had told me a year ago that my life would completely unravel, I would have just smiled and walked away. I always thought I was lucky. Good job in marketing, a cozy apartment in suburban Chicago, caring parents, and a sister with whom I had my disagreements. But we still considered ourselves close. And of course, Michael, the man I thought I would spend the rest of my life with. I met him at a corporate party. He was smart, witty in a subtle way, and somehow had this ability to make you feel like you were the only person in the room. From the very first conversation, I felt a spark, something I hadn't felt before. Within 6 months, our relationship had grown serious. We talked about the future, about family, about all the plans we wanted to make together. And that's when I decided it was time for Michael to meet my family. I wanted everything to be perfect. My parents loved the idea. They always enjoyed meeting the people I cared about. My sister, Emily, seemed excited too, or so I thought. I spent days planning the dinner, my mom's favorite recipes, the dining room perfectly set, even Michael's favorite wine on the table. I wanted him to feel at home, to see that my family was part of my life, and to understand where I came from. The evening started well. Michael was polite, laughed at the right moments, complimented my mother's cooking, and tried to make small talk with Emily. But even as I watched him, something felt off. There was a tension in Emily's smile that I couldn't place. Michael seemed nervous, fidgeting slightly whenever she spoke. I chalked it up to first meeting jitters. Then, halfway through dinner, I noticed a glance between them, a look that didn't belong to strangers. My stomach twisted. I asked Emily something about her work, trying to ignore the unease creeping up my chest, but she didn't answer immediately. She just smiled in a way that felt different. And then Michael, in a way that was subtle but unmistakable, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. I tried to brush it off. Maybe I was imagining things. Maybe I was reading too much into small gestures. But deep down, a knot of dread had formed. The rest of the evening passed with forced smiles and polite laughter, but that underlying tension never left. That night, as Michael and I walked back to my apartment, I tried to shake the feeling off, telling myself I was overthinking, but I couldn't. Something was wrong, and I had no idea how wrong it truly was. The next morning, I found a message on Michael's phone, a message from Emily. My heart froze before I even read it, and the words hit me like a punch. They had been seeing each other for months, all this time, all those promises, all those plans. It had been a lie. I sat there, staring at my phone, my hands shaking, my mind racing. Betrayal isn't just a word. It's a living thing that twists inside you, consuming every thought, every memory, until nothing feels safe anymore. And in that moment, I realized that nothing would ever be the same. Not Michael, not Emily, not even me. I didn't know it yet, but this betrayal would set off a chain of events that would change our family forever. And I was about to find out just how far I was willing to go for revenge. The next few days were a blur of anger, disbelief, and sleepless nights. I barely spoke to Emily. Every time I saw her, I felt this mix of rage and hurt that made my chest tighten. I couldn't understand why she would do this, why she would betray me for some fleeting affair with Michael, who I had trusted completely. And Michael, I didn't even want to look at him. I kept imagining the two of them laughing together behind my back, sharing secrets, while I believed I was building a future with him. I tried to reach out to Michael. I needed answers, closure, anything to make sense of the chaos. But every time I called or texted, he avoided me. And when we finally met face to face, he looked at me with that guilty, apologetic expression that only made my stomach twist harder. "Lauren, it's not what you think," he started, but I stopped him. I didn't want excuses. I wanted the truth. And slowly, painfully, he admitted everything. Months of lies, secret meetings, stolen moments, all while pretending to be committed to me. Emily, on the other hand, seemed almost proud of herself. She wasn't hiding the fact that she had gotten what she wanted. The betrayal wasn't just romantic. It was familial, emotional, and it cut deeper than I could have imagined. I found myself asking, how well do we ever really know the people we love? How close is too close? And at what point does love become manipulation? I spent hours replaying conversations in my head, trying to find signs, clues, anything that would explain their behavior. Every little smile, every glance now seemed loaded with hidden meaning. I felt like an intruder in my own life. My parents noticed my distance, my irritability. They asked if something was wrong, and I just smiled faintly, saying I was stressed from work. I didn't want them involved yet. I needed to figure this out on my own. And then, slowly, a dangerous thought began to form. If they thought they could hurt me without consequence, they were wrong. I could feel the spark of revenge igniting inside me. Not a reckless, impulsive anger, but a calculated, simmering fire that demanded justice. I didn't just want them to feel guilty. I wanted them to understand the magnitude of what they had done, to face the pain they had caused me in a way they could never ignore. But I had to be careful. Michael was charming, intelligent, and selfish. He would see through any naive attempt at revenge. And Emily, well, Emily was cunning in ways I had never anticipated. She was used to getting what she wanted, and I knew she would fight back if I challenged her directly. The stakes were high, and I realized I had to plan every move carefully. Over the next few days, I observed them. I paid attention to their routines, their conversations, the little habits that made them human. Every small detail was a piece of the puzzle. I started jotting notes, connecting dots, considering possibilities. I wasn't ready to confront them yet, but the first stage of revenge had begun, not with action, but with understanding. I also found myself reflecting on my own feeling. Amid the rage and betrayal, there was a strange clarity. I realized how much I had allowed myself to be vulnerable, to trust blindly. And in that clarity, I understood that this experience, painful as it was, could make me stronger, not just emotionally, but strategically. I wasn't going to be a victim. I would take control, and when the time came, they would see just how far I was willing to go to reclaim what was mine, my dignity, my life, and the truth. And so, I waited, patiently, observing, planning, and preparing for the moment when the scales would tip. What I didn't yet know was how far I would push, or how devastating the consequences would be, not just for Michael, but for Emily, and ultimately for the fragile balance of our family. By the following week, I knew I couldn't wait any longer. The initial shock and raw anger had settled into something sharper, colder, a sense of purpose. Michael had been pretending he was innocent, hoping I'd forgive him like I always did with small mistakes. But this was different. This was betrayal at the highest level. And Emily was proud of what she had done. She wanted me to feel the hurt. She wanted control. Well, I was about to take control back. I started small, testing the waters. I asked Michael to come over under the pretense of needing to talk, casually observing his reactions. He was nervous, too nervous, and he didn't notice how much I had already figured out. I kept my voice calm, casual, but every word I spoke was carefully chosen, each one carrying a hidden weight. I wanted him to feel the tension, the unease, without giving away that I was already steps ahead. Emily, of course, noticed my new demeanor. She tried to provoke me with sarcastic comments about Michael, but I didn't rise to the bait. Instead, I smiled with a calm that unnerved her more than anger ever could. She had underestimated me, assuming that I was fragile, that I would crumble. She was wrong. Over the next few days, I gathered more information. I needed leverage, a way to make Michael feel the consequence of his actions. I discreetly spoke with some of his colleagues, friends I knew from past encounters. I asked questions, listening carefully, piecing together moments he thought were private. Every secret he had, every lie he told, I cataloged meticulously. I wasn't acting recklessly. I was preparing a plan that could not fail. At the same time, I observed Emily. I knew she would act if she suspected anything. She was cunning, but predictable in her ways. I watched her reactions, noting what made her proud, what made her insecure, and what she never expected from me. With this, I started mapping out the sequence of moves that would change everything. Then came the first deliberate step. Michael had an important meeting with his boss at work, a promotion he had been angling for months. I found out through mutual connections that he had been exaggerating his contributions, quietly taking credit for others' work. Using that information subtly, I planted evidence that contradicted his claims. It was enough to make his superiors question his integrity without pointing directly to me. I saw the panic in his eyes when the first signs of trouble appeared. For the first time, Michael wasn't charming, wasn't confident. He was scrambling, floundering in fear. And it was glorious, not because I enjoyed seeing him suffer, but because justice, finally, was taking its course. Emily watched too. She realized something was happening, though she didn't know what. I could see her frustration, her unease growing with every small victory I orchestrated. She thought she controlled the narrative, but she had already lost control. The balance had shifted. Every night I lay awake, going over the plan again and again. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about reclaiming my life, my agency, and showing both of them that betrayal has consequence. I wasn't going to be a victim, not anymore. And the deeper I delved into my strategy, the more I realized something unexpected. I was growing stronger, more focused, and more in tune with my own instincts than I had ever been before. By now, Michael's facade was cracking, and Emily's confidence was waning. I was patient, calculated, and deliberate. The storm was coming, and I was ready to watch it unfold on my terms. It was a Friday evening when I decided the next step had to be more direct. I invited Michael over, under the guise of sorting things out, while Emily was in the room, ostensibly just passing by. I wanted both of them present, to see the cracks in their composure, to make the tension undeniable. Michael arrived as usual, trying to put on his charm, but it was strained, forced. I kept my voice calm, casual, but every word carried weight. I began by casually mentioning his recent challenges at work. He froze, his eyes darting nervously, unsure whether I knew the full extent. I let a moment stretch, letting the silence amplify his discomfort. Emily, seated nearby, caught my gaze and stiffened. She could feel that something was off. Then I mentioned a few small details about his colleagues' reactions, things that he had assumed were private. I didn't reveal my sources, only the facts. His face went pale. He tried to laugh it off, but it was hollow, strained. Every instinct he had to manipulate and charm faltered under the weight of my quiet confidence. I could see him calculating, trying to figure out how I knew, yet I said nothing more. Emily's reaction was fascinating. At first she looked smug, thinking she had the upper hand. But as the tension in the room grew, I could see her smile falter. She had underestimated me, assuming my grief and betrayal would make me weak. And now she realized she had misjudged the storm I had been quietly building. I kept the conversation neutral, discussing everyday topics. Yet everything was a test. Every small acknowledgement of their behavior, every casual remark about integrity and trust was a carefully placed probe. Michael faltered multiple times, revealing his guilt with the smallest slip. Emily noticed it too, and I could see her mind racing, trying to regain control, but it was too late. By the end of the evening, Michael was visibly shaken. His confidence shattered, his facade crumbling. Emily sat silently, absorbing the reality that I had turned the tables completely. The power dynamic had shifted, and she knew it. My calm, calculated approach had left both of them uncertain and off balance. Later that night, after they left, I sat alone, feeling a mixture of relief and satisfaction. This was only the beginning. The stakes were higher than ever, and the game had entered its most dangerous phase. Every move now needed precision. Every decision mattered. But I was ready. For the first time, I felt in complete control of the situation. And somewhere deep inside, a part of me recognized a strange truth. This wasn't just revenge anymore. It was a lesson, a reckoning. They had underestimated me, and now they would witness the consequences of their choices, slowly, methodically, and undeniably. The next week, I began putting the pieces into motion. Michael's life outside our personal drama was about to be affected, and in a way he would never see coming. I knew enough about his work, his colleagues, and the delicate balance of his reputation to create cracks that would widen into irreparable fractures. I started subtly, dropping hints to his co-workers about discrepancies in his project reports. I never directly accused him, but enough to plant seeds of doubt. Questions started surfacing in team meetings, small whispers about inconsistencies in his work. Michael tried to deflect, but each attempt only deepened the suspicion. I could practically see the panic building behind his eyes every time someone challenged his statements. Emily noticed the change immediately. At first, she was smug, thinking she was simply watching me navigate my grief. But as the tension around Michael escalated, her amusement turned into unease. I wasn't just hurting him emotionally, I was dismantling the world he had carefully constructed around himself. She had expected him to remain confident, untouchable, but I was eroding that illusion, brick by brick. Meanwhile, I maintained a composed exterior. To my parents, I acted as if life went on normally, but inside, I was orchestrating a storm. I couldn't allow Michael or Emily to sense my full intent. They had to underestimate me, to believe I was still fragile, still broken. And so I smiled, laughed at family dinners, and pretended to move past the betrayal, all while quietly collecting more information. One night, I confronted Michael under the guise of wanting to help him with a work problem. I subtly referenced errors and discrepancies he hadn't noticed yet. The way he shifted in his chair, the way his confidence wavered, it was intoxicating in its justice. I didn't gloat, I didn't raise my voice. I let him experience the consequences quietly, painfully, leaving him to wrestle with his growing anxiety. Emily was watching from the sidelines, trying to intervene, but every attempt she made to manipulate the situation fell flat. I anticipated her moves, predicted her reactions, and countered them with subtle precision. The tables had turned, and the dynamic between us had shifted entirely. For the first time, she realized she wasn't the one in control anymore. As the days passed, Michael's relationships at work began to fray. Colleagues started distancing themselves, subtly questioning his honesty and integrity. Rumors began to swirl, and he grew paranoid, reaching out to me for reassurance, only to receive calm, measured responses that hinted at consequences without ever spelling them out. The satisfaction wasn't in seeing him suffer for its own sake. It was in the justice of it, in reclaiming control of a life that had been disrupted by betrayal. And amidst it all, I learned something vital. Patience and strategy were more powerful than rage alone. By observing, understanding, and calculating every move, I had turned a moment of weakness into a position of strength. Emily, for her part, was forced to confront reality. She could see that her attempt to hurt me had failed, and that I had risen stronger, sharper, and more determined than ever. The tension between us thickened, charged with unspoken truths and shifting loyalties. It was clear that the coming weeks would test the limits of trust, family, and morality in ways none of us had anticipated. And somewhere, deep down, I knew this was only the beginning. Michael's downfall was in motion, Emily's overconfidence had been shattered, and I was finally beginning to understand the true power of taking control of a betrayal rather than letting it control me. By the middle of the following week, Michael's world was beginning to unravel. Subtle doubts from co-workers had turned into pointed questions, whispers in hallways, and tense meetings with his superiors. He had become defensive, anxious, and increasingly erratic. I watched from a careful distance, never gloating, only observing the natural consequence of the lies he had built his life upon. Emily, meanwhile, was growing impatient. She had assumed that my revenge would be short-lived, a temporary flare of anger that would fizzle out. But she began noticing the pattern. Every time she tried to regain control or defend Michael, it only deepened the cracks. Her confidence started to waver, her previously sharp edge dulling under the weight of unforeseen consequence. For the first time, she realized that she had underestimated me completely. One evening, I confronted Michael in private. I didn't yell, I didn't cry, I simply laid out facts that even he couldn't deny. Emails, contradictions, and subtle but undeniable proof of his failures. The look on his face was a mixture of shock and fear, the kind that comes when someone realizes the world they meticulously constructed is collapsing. "You always thought I wouldn't notice," I said quietly. "But I did. And now you're going to see what happens when lies catch up with you." His eyes widened, and he opened his mouth to argue. But I stopped him. I wasn't interested in his excuses. They meant nothing now. What mattered was accountability, and I had all the leverage I needed. Emily, watching from the other room, shifted uncomfortably. She had expected some drama, perhaps even an emotional explosion. But this measured approach, calm, precise, and devastating, was something she hadn't anticipated. I could see her processing the reality. I was no longer the sister who could be dismissed or manipulated. I was the one steering the storm. Over the next few days, the pressure on Michael intensified. A meeting with his boss became a pivotal moment. I had planted carefully phrased concerns with a few trusted colleagues who knew the truth, and now those concerns were being formally discussed. Michael's responses were shaky, defensive, and transparent. Every slip, every misstep amplified the consequence. Meanwhile, I maintained a delicate balance with Emily. We exchanged words, subtle barbs, and silent acknowledgments of our shared history. I realized that while Michael was the target of my revenge, my relationship with Emily needed careful handling. She had been a part of the betrayal, yes, but she was also my sister, and the bond we shared couldn't simply be discarded. I began to notice a shift in her demeanor. She was no longer casually smug or confident. She was wary, cautious, even reflective. She had begun to see Michael differently, through the lens I had been using all along. I suspected that secretly she was starting to realize he wasn't worth her loyalty, or mine. By the end of the week, Michael's personal and professional lives were both fraying. He reached out to me again, this time with a tone that was almost pleading, seeking reassurance or perhaps a lifeline. I remained calm, measured, and distant. I let him feel the consequences fully, allowing the weight of his actions to settle in. Through it all, Emily and I began to share small, tentative conversations. Not yet reconciliation, but the beginnings of understanding. For the first time since the betrayal, there was a glimmer of connection, a subtle acknowledgement that despite everything, we were still sisters. And I realized something important. Revenge could be powerful, but forgiveness, or at least clarity, was the step that would allow me to move forward. By now, the tension had reached a boiling point. Michael was no longer the confident, charming man I once thought I knew. Every interaction was a test, every conversation a trap for him to stumble into. I had carefully orchestrated events so that his professional reputation, his friendships, and even the small illusions of his personal life were crumbling before him. The pivotal moment came during a company review meeting. I had discreetly alerted a few colleagues to inconsistencies in Michael's recent projects, and by the time he walked into the room, there was already a palpable tension. Questions were pointed, facts were checked, and Michael's usual charisma faltered. I watched quietly from a distance, my heart pounding with a mixture of satisfaction and nervous anticipation. He faltered under scrutiny, his excuses weak and unconvincing. The people who had once praised him now looked at him with doubt, and some avoided eye contact altogether. Emily was observing too, and I could see the shift in her expression. There was a mix of surprise and admiration. Though she would never admit it aloud, she had underestimated not just me, but the depth of my patience, strategy, and understanding of both Michael and herself. For the first time, she recognized that I was not the powerless sister she once tried to manipulate. After the meeting, Michael confronted me privately, desperate to salvage some shred of dignity. "Lauren, please," he pleaded. "You're going too far. I didn't mean for it to get this bad." I met his gaze calmly, without a word. His excuses held no weight now, and he understood it instinctively. The fear in his eyes spoke louder than any apology could. Emily, later that evening, approached me cautiously. You really did it," she said softly, almost reluctantly. "I didn't think you had it in you." I allowed myself a small, controlled smile. "It wasn't just about revenge," I replied. "It was about understanding, control, and making sure the truth mattered." She nodded, quietly absorbing the gravity of the situation. In the days that followed, Michael's life continued to unravel. His professional credibility suffered, his personal relationships were strained, and the charm that had once shielded him from consequences had completely vanished. I maintained a calm, composed exterior, even as I secretly celebrated the justice unfolding before me. Meanwhile, Emily and I began a series of honest, if tentative, conversations. For the first time since the betrayal, we spoke openly about what had happened, why it hurt, and how we had each been affected. Slowly, the walls between us began to crumble. The dynamic that had once been strained, tense, and competitive was starting to shift toward understanding and cautious reconciliation. I realized that while Michael had been the catalyst for our conflict, the true work lay in repairing my bond with Emily. Our shared history, our familial connection, and the love beneath the betrayal all demanded careful attention. The process was painful, but necessary. By the end of the week, I felt a strange mixture of relief and resolve. Michael had received the consequences of his actions, and Emily and I were beginning to rebuild a fragile but genuine connection. For the first time since the betrayal, I sensed a path forward. Not just revenge, but understanding, healing, and ultimately, empowerment. After weeks of careful planning and quiet observation, the atmosphere began to shift. Michael's life had been shaken to its core, and his attempts to regain control only highlighted the cracks that had formed. I watched him falter, knowing that the consequences of his actions were finally catching up. But more importantly, I focused on Emily. The betrayal was still fresh, but the raw edges were softening as we cautiously began rebuilding our connection. It started with small gestures, brief conversations about trivial things, shared memories from childhood, and tentative smiles that slowly replaced awkward tension. I realized that while the betrayal had been devastating, it also created an opportunity for honesty. For the first time in months, Emily and I spoke without the underlying current of manipulation or competition. Michael, on the other hand, grew increasingly desperate. His friends and colleagues had begun distancing themselves, and he could feel the isolation that comes with losing trust. I remained composed during our interactions, never raising my voice, never showing triumph. I had learned that subtlety and patience were far more effective than outbursts. Every small consequence he faced, every glance of doubt or hesitation from those around him, was part of the plan. One evening, Emily and I had a long conversation in my apartment. The night was quiet, the kind of silence that encourages reflection. "I didn't expect you to handle it like this," she admitted, her voice low and tinged with both admiration and lingering guilt. I shrugged, trying to appear casual, but inside I felt a mix of relief and cautious optimism. "It wasn't just about him," I said. "It was about us, about understanding the truth and reclaiming control." Emily nodded, processing the weight of my words. For the first time, I felt that our bond might actually survive the betrayal. She began to understand that Michael's actions were a reflection of his character, not a reflection of our worth or our relationship as sisters. And I began to see that forgiveness, or at least clarity, was possible, even if it would take time. Meanwhile, Michael reached a breaking point. His attempts to repair his professional reputation failed repeatedly. Friends who had once supported him now questioned every word, every action. The charm and confidence that had once allowed him to manipulate situations no longer worked. He began to understand the consequences of his choices, the ripple effects of lies and deceit, and the price of underestimating me. Emily and I continued our tentative journey toward reconciliation. We spoke more openly about our feelings, about the hurt, and about the lessons we had learned. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't linear, but each conversation, each shared memory, each acknowledgement of pain brought us closer. By the end of this period, a sense of equilibrium began to emerge. Michael's influence over our lives had diminished significantly. Emily and I were rebuilding our relationship, cautiously but sincerely, learning to trust again. And I realized something profound. The act of taking control, of facing betrayal with strategy and clarity, had not only exposed the truth, but had also empowered me to reclaim my life, my relationships, and my sense of self. For the first time in months, I felt a glimmer of peace. The storm had passed, and though the wreckage remained, there was a path forward, one built on honesty, accountability, and the possibility of renewed trust. By now, Michael was on the brink. The subtle manipulations, the quiet consequence, and the cumulative pressure from both his professional and personal circles had left him vulnerable, exposed, and desperate. He tried one last time to regain control, to charm his way back into our lives. But it was clear to everyone, including himself, that the man I had once loved was gone. I decided it was time for the final act. Not a reckless confrontation, but a calculated closure. I arranged a private meeting with him, under the pretense of discussing what comes next. When he arrived, his usual confident smile was gone, replaced by a look of resignation and fear. He knew that whatever he had left, it was slipping away. I spoke calmly, deliberately. Every word was precise, leaving no room for excuses or manipulation. I recounted the betrayals, the lies, the damage caused, not with anger, but with unwavering clarity. I watched as his shoulders slumped and his eyes widened, realizing the full weight of his actions. There was no charm left, no excuses, only the cold mirror of accountability. "You had a choice," I said quietly, meeting his gaze. "And you chose poorly. There's nothing left to fix." He tried to speak, but I shook my head. I wasn't there for his pleas or apologies. I wasn't there to rekindle anything. I had taken control of the situation, and now it was time for the natural consequences to run their course. Emily, who had been silently observing, finally spoke. Her voice was low, reflective. "I didn't expect it to end like this," she admitted. "But you were right. He wasn't worth it." Her words resonated with me. For months, we had both been caught in a web of anger, betrayal, and tension. But now, the truth was clear. Michael's actions had revealed his true character, and it was toxic, unworthy of our trust or love. For the first time, Emily and I truly aligned, not as competitors or adversaries, but as sisters who had endured betrayal and emerged stronger together. The final weeks of Michael's unraveling were quiet but decisive. His reputation, strained friendships, and personal relationships collapsed under the weight of the consequences he had long avoided. I maintained my composure throughout, allowing the natural order of cause and effect to unfold. I didn't need to gloat. Justice was sufficient in itself. Meanwhile, Emily and I began rebuilding our bond. It wasn't instantaneous, and it wasn't perfect, but there was progress. We spoke openly, laughed occasionally, and began to recognize the resilience in each other that had always existed beneath the surface of conflict. Slowly, cautiously, trust was returning, and with it, a sense of hope. In this process, I realized something essential. Revenge, when executed thoughtfully, can be transformative. It teaches lessons about boundaries, personal strength, and the value of discernment. But it also reveals the importance of family, of forgiveness, and of recognizing who truly matters in your life. By the end of this chapter, the storm had subsided. Michael was no longer part of our lives, and the bond between Emily and me had been tempered in fire, emerging stronger and more resilient. We had faced betrayal, chaos, and pain, and we had survived. After Michael was finally removed from the equation, Emily and I began to focus on rebuilding our lives. It wasn't just about repairing what had been broken. It was about understanding, learning, and reclaiming ourselves. The betrayal had left scars, but it had also revealed truths that neither of us could ignore. We started talking more openly, discussing our feelings about the past months. Emily admitted her part in the betrayal, not as an excuse, but as an acknowledgement. It was a difficult conversation, full of pauses, lingering silences, and careful word choices, but for the first time, it felt like honesty was possible, without fear of judgment or retaliation. I realized how much I had changed through this ordeal. The rage that had fueled me during the height of the conflict had evolved into clarity and strength. I no longer felt like a victim. I had taken control of the chaos, shaped it into a course of justice, and come out stronger on the other side. Michael's absence was liberating. His presence had been a constant source of tension, lies, and manipulation. Emily and I began to reconnect with shared memories of our childhood, rediscovering laughter that had been buried beneath years of rivalry and hurt. We went for long walks, reminisced about family vacations, and even started planning small outings together. It wasn't perfect, and there were moments when past resentments surfaced, but each step forward was progress. Meanwhile, I had to confront the reality of my relationship with Michael. The man I thought I loved had been revealed for who he truly was, and holding on to him would have meant compromising everything I had fought to regain. I realized that forgiveness for myself didn't mean reconciling with him. Instead, it meant cutting ties completely, letting go of the pain, and choosing to prioritize my well-being. I confronted him one last time, not with anger, but with finality. "This ends here," I said simply. "There's nothing left for us. You've shown who you are, and I won't let that define my life." There was no argument, no pleading from him that could change the truth. The conversation was brief, but it felt like a heavy weight had been lifted. In the weeks that followed, I felt a sense of freedom I hadn't experienced in a long time. The tension that had haunted my life began to dissipate, replaced by a cautious but growing peace. Emily and I were still rebuilding, still navigating the aftermath, but there was hope. We had survived the storm together, and that resilience forged a bond that neither betrayal nor time could easily break. By the end of this period, I finally understood that revenge, while necessary at the time, had been a tool, not a destination. The true goal had always been clarity, justice, and ultimately, self-empowerment. And in that understanding, I began to feel whole again.